Chapter 12. Of original righteousness, natural corruption, Satan's joining with it, and our duty thereupon. Objection 1. But here mark a plot of spiritual treason. Satan, joining with our corruption, sets the wit on work to persuade the soul that this inward rebellion is not so bad, because it is natural to us, as a condition of nature rising out of the first principles in our creation, and was curbed in by the bridle of original righteousness, which they would have accessory and supernatural, and therefore allege that concupiscence is less odious and more excusable in us, and so no great danger in yielding and betraying our souls unto it, and by that means persuading us that that which is our deadliest enemy hath no harm in it, nor means any to us. Answer. This rebellion of lusts against the understanding is not natural, as our nature came out of God's hands at the first, Genesis 1:27, for this, being evil and the cause of evil, could not come from God, who is good and the cause of all good, and nothing but good, who, upon the creation of all things, pronounced them good, and, after the creation of man, pronounced of all things that they were very good, verse 31. Now, that which is ill and very ill cannot be seated at the same time in that which is good and very good. God created man at the first right, he of himself sought out many inventions, Ecclesiastes 7:29. As God beautified the heaven with stars, and decked the earth with variety of plants, and herbs, and flowers, so he adorned man, his prime creature here below, with all those endowments that were fit for a happy condition. An original righteousness was fit and due to an original and happy condition. Therefore, as the angels were created with all angelical perfections, and as our bodies were created in an absolute temper of all the humours, so the soul was created in that sweet harmony wherein there was no discord, as an instrument in tune, fit to be moved to any duty, as a clean, neat glass. The soul represented God's image and holiness. 2. Therefore it is so far that concupiscence should be natural, that the contrary to it, namely, righteousness, wherein Adam was created, was natural to him, though it were planted in man's nature by God, and so in regard of the cause of it was supernatural, yet because it was agreeable to that happy condition, without which he could not subsist, in that respect it was natural, and should have been derived, if he had stood, together with his nature, to his posterity. As heat in the air, though it hath its first impression from the heat of the sun, yet is natural, because it agrees to the nature of that element, and though man be compounded of a spiritual and earthly substance, yet it is natural that the baser earthly part should be subject to the superior. Because where there is different degrees of worthiness, it is fit there should be a subordination of the meaner to that which is in order higher. The body naturally desires food and bodily contentments, yet in a man endued with reason, this desire is governed so as it becomes not inordinate. A beast sins not in its appetite, because it hath no power above to order it. A man that lives in a solitary place, far remote from company, may take his liberty to live as it pleases him, but if he comes to live under the government of some well-ordered city, then he is bound to submit to the laws and customs of that city, under penalty upon any breach of order. So the risings of the soul, howsoever in other creatures they are not blamable, having no commander in themselves, above them, yet in man they are to be ordered by reason and judgment. Therefore it cannot be, that concupiscence should be natural, in regard of the state of creation. It was Adam's sin, which had many sins in the womb of it, that brought this disorder upon the soul. Adam's person first corrupted our nature, and nature being corrupted, corrupts our persons, and our persons being corrupted, increase the corruption of our nature, by custom of sinning, which is another nature in us. As a stream, the farther it runs from the spring head, the more it enlarges its channel, by the running of lesser rivers into it, until it empties itself into the sea, so corruption, till it be overpowered by grace, swells bigger and bigger, so that though this disorder was not natural, In regard of the first creation, yet since the fall it has become natural, even as we call that which is common to the whole kind, and propagated from parents to their children, to be natural, so that it is both natural and against nature, natural now, but against nature in its first perfection. And because corruption is natural to us, therefore, 1. We delight in it, whence it comes to pass, that our souls are carried along in an easy current, to the committing of any sin without opposition. 2. Because it is natural, therefore it is unwearied and restless, as light bodies are not wearied in their motion upwards, nor heavy bodies in their motion downwards, nor a stream in its running to the sea, because it is natural. Hence it is that the old man, Ephesians 4:22, is never tired in the works of the flesh, Galatians 5:19, nor never drawn dry. When men cannot act sin, yet they will love sin, and act it over again by pleasing thoughts of it, and by sinful speculations suck out the delight of sin, and are grieved, not for their sin, but because they want strength and opportunity to commit it, if sin would not leave them. They would never leave sin. This corruption of our nature is not wrought in us by reason and persuasions, for then it might be satisfied with reasons, but it is in us by way of a natural inclination, as iron is carried to the lodestone. Until our natures be altered, no reason will long prevail, but our sinful disposition. As a stream stopped for a little while, will break out with greater violence. 3. Being natural, it needs no help, as the earth needs no tillage to bring forth weeds. When our corrupt nature is carried contrary to that which is good, it is carried of itself, as when Satan lies or murders, it comes from his own cursed nature, and though Satan joins with our corrupt nature, yet the proneness to sin, and the consent unto it, is of ourselves. Question. But how shall we know that Satan joins with our nature, in those actions unto which nature itself is prone? Answer. Then Satan adds his help, when our nature is carried more eagerly than ordinary to sin, as when a stream runs violently, we may know that there is not only the tide, but the wind that carries it. So in sudden and violent rebellions, it is Satan that pushes on nature left to itself of God. A stone falls downwards by its own weight, but if it falls very swiftly, we know it is thrown down by an outward mover. Though there were no devil, yet our corrupt nature would act Satan's part against itself. It would have a supply of wickedness, as a serpent doth poison, from itself, it hath a spring to feed it. No one is nourishing it, it is Satan who does it, etc. Augustine. But that man, whilst he lives here, is not altogether excluded from hope of happiness, and hath a nature not so large and capable of sin as Satan's, whereupon he is not so obstinate in hating God and working mischief as he, etc. Otherwise there is, for kind, the same cursed disposition, and malice of nature against true goodness in man, which is in the devils and damned spirits themselves. It is no mitigation of sin, to plead it is natural, for natural diseases, as leprosies, that are derived from parents, are most dangerous, and least curable. Neither is this any excuse, for because as it is natural, so it is voluntary, not only in Adam, in whose loins we were, and therefore sinned, but likewise in regard of ourselves, who are so far from stopping the course of sin either in ourselves or others, that we feed and strengthen it, or at least give more way to it, and provide less against it than we should, until we come under the government of grace, and by that means we justify Adam's sin, and that corrupt estate that follows upon it, and show, that if we had been in Adam's condition ourselves, we would have made that ill choice which he made. And though this corruption of our nature be necessary to us, yet it is no violent necessity from an outward cause, but a necessity that we willingly pull upon ourselves, and therefore ought the more to humble us, for the more necessarily we sin, the more voluntarily, and the more voluntarily, the more necessarily, the will putting itself voluntarily into these fetters of sin. Necessity is no plea, when the will is the immediate cause of any action. Whatever the soul commanded itself to do, it will obtain, Seneca. Men's hearts tell them they might rule their desires if they would, for tell a man of any dish which he likes, that there is poison in it, and he will not meddle with it, so tell him that death is in that sin which he is about to commit, and he will abstain. If he believe it to be so, if he believe it not, it is his voluntary unbelief and atheism. If the will would use that sovereignty it should, and could, at the first, we should be altogether freed from this necessity. Men are not damned because they cannot do better, but because they will do no better. If there were no will, there would be no hell. If there were no will, hell would not exist either. For men willingly submit to the rule and law of sin, they plead for it, and like it so well, as they hate nothing so much as that which any way withstands those lawless laws. Those that think it their happiness to do what they will, that they might be free, cross their own desires, for this is the way to make the most perfect slaves. When our will is the next immediate cause of sin, and our consciences bear witness to us that it is so, then conscience is ready to take God's part in accusing ourselves. Our consciences tell us to our faces that we might do more than we do to hinder sin, and that when we sin, it is not through weakness, but out of the wickedness of our nature. Our consciences tell us that we sin not only willingly, but often with delight, so far forth as we are not subdued by grace, or awed by something above us, and that we esteem any restraint to be our misery. And where by grace the will is strengthened, so that it yields not a full consent, yet a gracious soul is humbled even for the sudden risings of corruption that prevent deliberation. As here David, though he withstood the risings of his heart, yet he was troubled, that he had so vile a heart that would rise up against God, and therefore takes it down. Who is there that hath not cause to be humbled, not only for his corruption, but that he doth not resist with that strength, nor labor to prevent it with that diligence which his heart tells him he might? We cannot have too deep apprehensions of this breeding sin, the mother and nurse of all abominations, for the more we consider the height, the depth, the breadth, and length of it, the more shall we be humbled in ourselves, and magnify the height, the depth, the breadth, and the length of God's mercy in Christ. Ephesians 3:18. The favorers of nature are always the enemies of grace. This, which some think and speak so weakly and faintly of, is a worse enemy to us than the devil himself, a more near, a more restless, a more traitorous enemy, for by intelligence with it the devil doth us all the hurt he doth, and by it maintains forts in us against goodness. This is that which, either by discouragement or contrariety, hinders us from good, or else, by deadness, tediousness, distractions, or corrupt aims, hinders us in doing good. This puts us on to evil, and abuses what is good in us, or from us, to cover or color sin, and furnishes us with reasons either to maintain what is evil, or shifts to translate it upon false causes, or fences to arm us against whatsoever shall oppose us in our wicked ways, though it neither can nor will be good, yet it would be thought to be so by others, and enforces a conceit upon itself that it is good. It imprisons and keeps down all light that may discover it, both within itself and without itself. If it lie in its power, it flatters itself, and would have all the world flatter it too, which, if it doth not, it frets, especially if it be once discovered and crossed. Hence comes all the plotting against goodness, that sin may reign without control. Is it not a lamentable case that man, who, out of the very principles of nature, cannot but desire happiness and abhor misery, yet should be in love with eternal misery in the causes of it, and abhor happiness in the ways that lead unto it? This shows us what a wonderful deordination and disorder is brought upon man's nature, for every other creature is naturally carried to that which is helpful unto it, and shuns that which is any way hurtful and offensive. Only man is in love with his own bane, and fights for those lusts that fight against his soul. Our duty is, 1. To labor to see this sinful disposition of ours, not only as it is discovered in the Scriptures, but as it discovers itself in our own hearts. This must be done by the light and teaching of God's Spirit, who knows us and all the turnings and windings and byways of our souls, better than we know ourselves. We must see it as the most odious and loathsome thing in the world, making our natures contrary to God's pure nature, and of all other duties making us most indisposed to spiritual duties, wherein we should have nearest communion with God, because it seizes on the very spirits of our minds. 2. We should look upon it as worse than any of those filthy streams that come from it, nay, than all the impure issues of our lives together. There is more fire in the furnace than in the sparkles, there is more poison in the root than in all the branches. For if the stream were stopped, and the branches cut off, and the sparkles quenched, yet there would be a perpetual supply. As in good things, the cause is better than the effect, so in ill things the cause is worse. Every fruit should make this poisonful root more hateful to us, and the root should make us hate the fruit more, as coming from so bad a root, as being worse in the cause than in itself. The affection is worse than the action, which may be forced or counterfeited. We cry out upon particular sins, but are not humbled as we should be for our impure dispositions, without the sight of which there can be, 1. No sound repentance arising from the deep and thorough consideration of sin, 2. No desire to be new molded, without which we can never enter into so holy a place as heaven, 3. No self-denial, till we see the best things in us are enmity against God, 4. No high prizing of Christ, without whom our natures, our persons, and our actions are abominable in God's sight, 5. Nor any solid peace settled in the soul, which peace arises not from the ignorance of our corruption, or compounding with it, but from sight and hatred of it, and strength against it. 3. Consider the spiritualness and large extent of the law of God, together with the curse annexed, which forbids not only particular sins, but all the kinds, degrees, occasions, and furtherances of sin in the whole breadth and depth of it, and our very nature itself. So far as it is corrupted, for want of which we see many alive without the law, Romans 7:9, jovial and merry from ignorance of their misery, who, if they did but once see their natures and lives in that glass, it would take away that liveliness and courage from them, and make them vile in their own eyes. Men usually look themselves in the laws of the state wherein they live, and think themselves good enough, if they are free from the danger of penal statutes. This glass discovers only foul spots, gross scandals, and breakings out, or else they judge of themselves by parts of nature, or common grace, or by outward conformity to religion, or else by that light they have to guide themselves in the affairs of this life, by their fair and civil carriage, etc., and thereupon live and die without any sense of the power of godliness, which begins in the right knowledge of ourselves, and ends in the right knowledge of God. The spiritualness and purity of the law should teach us to consider the purity and holiness of God, the bringing of our souls into whose presence will make us to abhor ourselves, with Job, in dust and ashes, Job 42:6. Contraries are best seen by setting one near the other, whilst we look only on ourselves, and upon others amongst whom we live, we think ourselves to be somebody. It is an evidence of some sincerity wrought in the soul, not to shun that light which may let us see the foul corners of our hearts and lives. 4. The consideration of this likewise should enforce us to carry a double guard over our souls. David was very watchful, yet we see here he was surprised unawares by the sudden rebellion of his heart. We should observe our hearts as governors do rebels and mutinous persons. Observation awes the heart. We see to what an excess sin grows in those that deny themselves nothing, nor will be denied in anything, who, if they may do what they will do what they may, who turn liberty into license, and make all their abilities and advantages to do good contributory to the commands of overruling and unruly lusts. Were it not that God partly by his power suppresses, and partly by his grace subdues the disorders of man's nature for the good of society, and the gathering of a church upon earth, corruption would swell to that excess, that it would overturn and confound all things together with itself. Although there be a common corruption that cleaves to the nature of all men in general, as distrust in God, self-love, a carnal and worldly disposition, etc. Yet God so orders it, that in some there is an ebb and decrease, in others, God justly leaving them to themselves, a flow and increase of sinfulness, even beyond the bounds of ordinary corruption, whereby they become worse than themselves, either like beasts in sensuality, or like devils in spiritual wickedness. Though all be blind in spiritual things, yet some are more blinded, though all be hard-hearted, yet some are more hardened, though all be corrupt in evil courses, yet some are more corrupted, and sink deeper into rebellion than others. Sometimes God suffers this corruption to break out in civil men, yea even in his own children, that they may know themselves the better, and because sometimes corruption is weakened not only by smothering, but by having a vent. Whereupon grace stirs up in the soul a fresh hatred and revenge against it, and lets us see a necessity of having whole Christ, not only to pardon sin, but to purge and cleanse our sinful natures. Caution. But yet that which is ill in itself, must not be done for the good that comes by it by accident. This must be a comfort after our surprisals, not an encouragement before. 5. And because the divine nature, wrought in us by divine truth, together with the Spirit of God, is the only counterpoison against all sin, and whatsoever is contrary to God in us, therefore we should labor that the truth of God may be grafted in our hearts, that so all the powers of our souls may relish of it, that there may be a sweet agreement betwixt the soul and all things that are spiritual, that truth being engrafted in our hearts, we may be engrafted into Christ, and grow up in him, and put him on more and more, and be changed into his likeness. Nothing in heaven or earth will work out corruption, and change our dispositions, but the Spirit of Christ, clothing divine truths with a divine power to this purpose. 6. When corruption rises, pray it down, as St. Paul did, 2 Corinthians 12:8, and to strengthen thy prayer, claim the promise of the new covenant, that God would circumcise our hearts, and wash us with clean water, that he would write his law in our hearts, and give us his Holy Spirit when we beg it, Ezekiel 36:25-27, and look upon Christ as a public fountain open for Judah and Jerusalem to wash in Zechariah 13:1. Herein consists our comfort, 1. That Christ hath all fullness for us, and that our nature is perfect in him, 2. That Christ in our nature hath satisfied divine justice, not only for the sin of our lives, but for the sin of our nature, and 3. That he will never give over until by his Spirit he hath made our nature holy and pure as his own, till he hath taken away not only the reign, but the very life and being of sin out of our hearts. 4. That to this end he leaves his Spirit and truth in the Church to the end of the world, that the seed of the Spirit may subdue the seed of the serpent in us, and that the Spirit may be a never-failing spring of all holy thoughts, desires, and endeavors in us, and dry up the contrary issue and spring of corrupt nature. And Christians must remember, when they are much annoyed with their corruptions, that it is not their particular case alone, but the condition of all God's people, lest they be discouraged by looking on the ugly deformed visage of old Adam, which affrights some so far that it makes them think no man's nature is so vile as theirs, which were well if it tended to humiliation only, but Satan often abuses it towards discouragement and desperation. Many out of a misconceit think that corruption is greatest when they feel it most, whereas indeed, the less we see it and lament it, the more it is. Sighs and groans of the soul are like the pores of the body, out of which in diseased persons sick humours break forth and so become less. The more we see and grieve for pride, which is an immediate issue of our corrupted nature, the less it is, because we see it by a contrary grace, the more sight the more hatred of sin, the more love of grace, and the more love the more life, which the more lively it is, the more it is sensible of the contrary. Upon every discovery and conflict corruption loses some ground, and grace gains upon it.